The Romans called them barbarians. Celts, the Germanic tribes and the ancestors of the Vikings, have long been remembered as violent, uncivilized outsiders, but the word barbarian never meant savage. In this video, we'll look past Roman bias and explore what archaeology and history actually reveal. Societies with laws, trade networks, skilled craftsmanship, and deep cultural traditions that challenge everything we think we know about the so-called barbarian world. So I think a good place to start is the origin of the word barbarian. The word barbarian did not originally mean savage or uncivilized. It comes from the ancient Greek term barbaros, used to describe people who did not speak Greek. To Greek ears, foreign languages sound like meaningless noise, or barbar, and the word simply meant outsider. When the Romans adopted the term, though, its meaning shifted. Barbarian now became a political label, used to define those beyond Roman control as inferior, dangerous, and uncivilized. The majority of our information about the Celts, Germans, and Norse from this time period do come from the Romans and Greeks, though, which is why we have the common misnomer of them as barbarians, but their accounts were never neutral. Authors like Julius Caesar and Tacitus were not ethnographers in the modern sense. They were politicians, generals, and moralists, writing for Roman audiences with Roman agendas. Describing foreign peoples as wild, dangerous, or uncivilized helped justify conquest and reinforced Rome's sense of superiority. Classical texts often portray Celts and Germans as crude and violent, living beyond law or order. Yet even within these biased accounts, contradictions do appear. Tacitus, for example, noted that the Germanic tribes enforced strict moral codes, punished adultery severely, and limited the power of their kings. Caesar, while campaigning in Gaul, described a structured Celtic society overseen by Druids who acted as judges, teachers, and religious authorities. When read carefully, Roman sources do not actually describe chaos or savagery. They describe societies that were different from Rome, and they were organized by custom rather than bureaucracy, and governed by tradition rather than written law. What later generations remembered as barbarism was in many cases simply cultural difference filtered through Roman prejudice. And so, let's begin with the first of our three societies, the Celts. The Celts mainly occupied Iron Age Gaul and Britain and were seen by the Romans as fierce adversaries. Julius Caesar's own commentary reveals a highly structured Celtic society. He observes that throughout all Gaul, there are two orders of those men who are of any rank and dignity: the nobility, the equites, and the Druids, while the rest of the people are protected dependents of the elites. Far from being lawless, the Celts entrusted the Druids with tremendous authority. According to Caesar, Druid priests determine almost all controversies, public and private, judging crimes, settling disputes over inheritance and boundaries, and issuing punishments. A person who defied a Druidic judgment could be excommunicated from society and treated as a pariah, the severest sanction among the Celts. This amounts to a legal system, a class of learned arbitrators, enforcing communal norms and religious law. Caesar even notes that an annual Druidic assembly convened in the territory of the Carnutes, a kind of general council for all of Gaul. Such details portray an organized society with mechanisms for governance and justice, utterly at odds with the notion of random barbarian anarchy. Education and oral tradition were keystones of Celtic culture. The Druids were not merely priests, but scholars. As Julius Caesar observed, they are said to learn by heart a great number of verses. Accordingly, some remain in the course of training 20 years, and they did not consider it lawful to commit sacred knowledge to writing. This emphasis on memorization and recitation directly contradicts the image of an unlettered people. For everyday purposes, the Gauls did use writing. Caesar notes that Greek letters were commonly employed, but religious and legal knowledge was deliberately preserved through memory and performance. This tradition produced highly trained bards and storytellers who carried history, law, and cultural values across generations, even if much of that knowledge was later lost when oral cultures collided with literate empires. Beyond social structure and learning, the craftsmanship and art of the Celts mark them as highly civilized. Archaeology has uncovered spectacular works, such as intricately wrought gold torques, weapons, and ceremonial items. And excuse my pronunciation on this one, but one of these is the famous Snetsham treasure from Britain, where over 200 gold, silver, and bronze torques were unearthed in Norfolk. And at that site was found the so-called Great Torque of Snetsham. And this was crafted by twisting 8 gold ropes and adorning the ends with detailed motifs using the sophisticated lost wax casting technique. A close examination of such Celtic artistry, as science writer Alice Roberts notes, reveals a scientifically sophisticated people with good links to the rest of Europe. In fact, analysis of these artifacts has shown advanced metallurgical techniques, including fire gliding to apply gold coatings, which the Celts likely learned through intercultural contact. Far from isolated primitives, Iron Age Celts were innovating and exchanging knowledge with distant regions. And their trade networks stretched across much of Europe, linking Iron Age communities to the Mediterranean world. Archaeology shows that Celtic elites imported wine, olive oil, and fine pottery from Greek and Etruscan traders. At the hill fort of Vix in modern France, archaeologists uncovered an enormous bronze wine cauldron, likely made in the Mediterranean, buried with a Celtic aristocratic woman around 500 BC. Finds like this reveal that the Celts were not isolated tribes on the fringes of civilization, but active participants in long-distance exchange networks that moved goods, ideas, and wealth across the continent. And so, in short, the early Celts of Northern Europe were no barbarians in the pejorative sense. They were sophisticated in their social order, skilled in arts and technology, and well integrated into the wider world. And if the Celts challenged the idea of barbarism through law, art, and trade, the Germanic tribes challenged it through discipline, custom, and community. And so now we turn to the Germanic tribes. The diverse peoples beyond the Rhine and Danube frontiers. Romans often branded them as ferocious, uncivilized foemen. Yet the detailed ethnography Germania in 98 AD by Tacitus gives a surprisingly respectful account of their customs, revealing a society governed by law, consensus, and a strong moral code. According to Tacitus, the Germanic tribes were governed not by unchecked rulers, but by law and collective decision-making. Kings were chosen by birth and war leaders by merit, yet their power was limited by customs and public consent. Legal matters were handled in tribal assemblies, where accusations could be brought openly and judgments rendered according to the established laws. These legal assemblies, later known as the Thing, formed the backbone of Germanic governance. Justice was communal, visible, and grounded in shared standards of honor and responsibility. Far from being lawless, these societies maintained order through councils, tradition, and accountability to the community. And socially, the Germanic tribes valued family and fidelity. Tacitus famously comments on their monogamy and strong marital bonds, implicitly contrasting Germanic chastity with what he saw as Roman decadence. Their marriage code, however, is strict, and indeed no part of their manners is more praiseworthy, he writes. Almost alone among barbarians, they are content with one wife. And the wife does not bring a dowry to the husband, but the husband brings to the wife. This anecdote highlights the dignity of women in their society. Women were entrusted with maintaining the home and were honored as vital members of the community. In fact, Germanic women sometimes held sway as seers or prophetesses. Tacitus notes that tribes believed a woman had a certain sanctity and prescience, citing the example of the prophetess Veleda, who was revered almost as a divinity. Such details underscored that Germanic culture had its own values of virtue and social cohesion that Romans could recognize, even if grudgingly. We see further complexity in their economy and trade networks. While largely agrarian and pastoral, Germanic societies were not isolated. There is evidence of extensive trade between the Roman Empire and the tribes beyond. Roman coins, jewelry, and glassware have been found in barbarian homelands, indicating active commerce. Tacitus observed that the frontier Germans quickly became adept at using Roman money. Those near the Rhine and Danube value gold and silver for their use in commerce, preferring certain familiar Roman coin types and even favoring silver over gold coins for everyday trade because smaller denominations were more practical. Furthermore, Northern Europe's famed Amber Road brought Baltic amber to Mediterranean markets since at least the Bronze Age, passing through Germanic territories. In return, Germanic elites eagerly imported Roman weapons, wine, and fine manufactures. This exchange is evident in archaeological finds. For example, high-status burials of Germanic chieftains sometimes included Roman-made weapons or imported bronze vessels, treasures likely obtained through trade or as diplomatic gifts. Such artifacts show that far from being economically stagnant, the northern tribes were connected to trans-European trade routes. Germanic societies also demonstrated considerable skill in craftsmanship. By the early centuries AD, metalworkers were producing finely made jewelry, weapons, and ornamental fittings, while woodworkers built durable homes and fortified settlements. A striking example is the Sutton Hoo ship burial in England, which contained elaborate gold and garnet fittings, a ceremonial helmet, and finely crafted weapons. Such artifacts show that Germanic tribes possessed advanced technical knowledge and artistic ability comparable to that of contemporary, civilized societies. We should also highlight the oral tradition and Germanic cultures. Like the Celts, the pre-literate Germans passed down history and myth through spoken word. Tacitus notes that in their ancient songs, their only form of recorded history, the Germans celebrate an earth-born god, Tuisto, and his son Manus, the fountainhead of their race. These traditional songs and epic chants, possibly the early form of what became Norse sagas and Germanic epic poetry, were central to preserving cultural memory. Storytelling, genealogy, recitations, and poetic praise of tribal heroes bound the community together across generations. Although the Germans did not write these down at the time, their oral literature was rich, and some of it eventually surfaced in medieval writings like the epic Beowulf, which was an Anglo-Saxon descendant of its oral tradition, or the Norse Eddas. Thus, the Germanic tribes were cultivators of culture in their own right, not blank slates awaiting civilization. In sum, the Germanic societies that Rome encountered were far from barbaric. They had orderly governance through assemblies and laws, a clear moral framework and social hierarchy, economic ties beyond their borders, and a thriving tradition of oral literature and lore. Tacitus may have been using the Germans as a mirror to critique Roman society, praising their simplicity, bravery, and virtue, but his account nonetheless confirms that these barbarians had societal institutions that any civilization would recognize: law, family, religion, and art. With modern archaeology adding concrete proof of their settlements, crafts, and trade, we can confidently say that Germanic peoples were no mere savages, but proud nations with their own form of civilization. Finally, let's consider the last of our three civilizations, the Norse ancestors, the early medieval Scandinavians who are often remembered simply as plundering Vikings. Popular imagination portrays Vikings as horn-helmeted brutes burning monasteries, but focusing only on their raiding exploits does a great injustice to Norse society as a whole. The Norse of the Viking Age, albeit a little bit later than the Roman Age we are talking about, but I think they are justified in being talked about due to them being the most popular modern caricature of a barbarian, built one of the most dynamic and well-connected cultures of their time, excelling in trade, governance, craftsmanship, and storytelling. These seafarers were not barbarian nomads, but rather savvy traders, explorers, settlers, and even statesmen on the European stage. One of the Norse's most impressive achievements was their trade network, which was truly global in reach. Viking Age Scandinavians engaged in vigorous commerce from the North Atlantic to the Middle East. Tens of thousands of Islamic silver coins unearthed in Sweden, Norway, and Finland provide concrete evidence of sustained exchange with the Islamic world. And the Vikings founded thriving mercantile towns, and again, forgive me for my pronunciation on these, but such as Birka in Sweden, Hedeby in Denmark, and Stråja Ladoga in Eastern Europe, where craftsmen and merchants exchanged goods from distant regions. In England, Viking York became a bustling center of international trade, while in Ireland they established Dublin as a major trading hub. Through these networks, the Norse integrated Northern Europe into a far-reaching economic system, linking continents long before the modern age of globalization. Norse society was organized around law and communal assemblies known as things, building on earlier Germanic traditions and developing them into highly structured systems of governance. These assemblies were regular, formal gatherings where disputes were settled, laws were affirmed, and collective decisions were made. They were not symbolic rituals, but the practical foundation of political and legal life. Things existed at multiple levels, from local assemblies to larger regional gatherings, and reached their most developed form in Iceland with the founding of the Althing in 930 AD. Each year, representatives from across the island met to hear cases, resolve conflicts, and maintain the legal order. The law itself was preserved orally by a law speaker who memorized and recited the legal code so that it remained known to the entire community. Norse law governed property, inheritance contracts, and compensation for injury, and it applied even to powerful chieftains and kings. Authority was not absolute, but constrained by custom and communal consent. Far from living in disorder, the Norse organized their society around law, accountability, and shared responsibility, a system that allowed communities to function without centralized states or standing armies. Norse society was organized into clearly defined social groups, reflecting a structured and ordered way of life. At the top were chieftains and kings, whose authority depended on reputation, alliances, and the support of free farmers rather than absolute power. Beneath them were the carls, free men and women who owned land, worked as farmers, craftsmen, and traders, and formed the backbone of the community. At the bottom were thralls, or enslaved people, who performed labor but were still recognized within the legal system, subject to laws governing ownership, injury, and compensation. What mattered most was not equality, but stability. Each group had recognized rights, duties, and legal standing. Norse society functioned through law, obligation, and mutual dependence, not through unchecked violence or arbitrary rule. Norse craftsmanship reflected the same balance of practicality, innovation, and order that defined their laws and trade networks. Their most famous achievement, the Viking longship, was not simply a tool of war, but a remarkable feat of engineering. Built with overlapping planks and a flexible clinker style, these ships were light, fast, and resilient. They could cross open oceans, survive rough seas, and still navigate shallow rivers far inland. This design gave the Norse unmatched ability, allowing them to trade, explore, raid, and settle across enormous distances, from the coasts of North America to the river systems of Eastern Europe. Shipbuilding, however, was only one part of a broader culture of skilled craftsmanship. Norse metalworkers produced strong, reliable weapons and finely made tools, while artisans crafted intricate jewelry, brooches, and arm rings using techniques learned through long-distance trade. Woodcarvers decorated ships, hulls, wagons, and everyday objects with complex animal and knotwork designs, transforming functional items into expressions of identity and belief. What stands out, though, is that art was not confined to elites or monuments. Beauty and craftsmanship were woven into daily life, into ships, tools, and homes. This fusion of function and design reveals a society that valued skill, innovation, and aesthetic expression. The Norse were not crude marauders improvising violence, but master builders and artisans whose technology and artistry helped sustain one of the most dynamic cultures of the early medieval world. The oral traditions and literature of the Norse are among the richest in the world. Although during the Viking Age the Norse had runes as a writing system, and they were used mainly for brief inscriptions, most of the storytelling was done orally by scops and skalds, or poets. The myths and legends of the Norse, tales of Odin, Thor, Freya, and the Epic of Ragnarok, were composed in poetic form and memorized across generations. These were eventually written down in works like the Poetic Edda and the Pros Edda in the 13th century, but the material is much older. Scholars note that the Eddic poems were minstrel poems, passed orally from singer to singer and from poet to poet for centuries. Imagine the imaginative capacity and cultural continuity required to orally transmit cycles of poems about gods and heroes over hundreds of years. This was an oral literature on par with Homer's epics. Additionally, the sagas of Iceland prose histories of early Norse settlers and legendary kings. These were first composed and shared orally before being recorded. These sagas, like Egil Saga or Njal Saga, written down in 13th century Iceland, preserve with remarkable realism the legal disputes, feuds, and everyday life of Norse people, indicating a strong storytelling tradition rooted in real social values. The emphasis on law in many sagas, especially Njal Saga, underscores again how highly the Norse esteemed a just society. What about literacy? It is true that the Norse did not write books during the Viking Age, but they were not illiterate in the strict sense. They developed the runic alphabet centuries earlier, and Vikings commonly inscribed runes on stone monuments and wooden carvings. In fact, runestones erected during the Viking Age number in the thousands, each bearing a memorial text for the dead. In Denmark alone, about 250 runestones are known, and in Sweden, over 3,000 such inscriptions have been found. These runestones bring us very close to the Vikings, featuring the names of people and often recounting their deeds or travels in a succinct narrative. For example, one famous runestone, raised by a woman named Ragnalid in Denmark, honors her husband, describing him as a priest and a nobleman, and even curses anyone who would deface the stone. These short texts demonstrate that Vikings memorialized history in writing to complement their oral lore. They cared about lineage, honor, and legacy, consistent with a cultured society. Taken together, the Norse world was far more than the violent caricature left behind by frightened chroniclers and later popular myth. Viking Age Scandinavians were traders operating across continents, lawmakers governing themselves through assemblies and shared legal traditions, skilled craftsmen capable of extraordinary engineering, and storytellers who preserved history, law, and identity through memory and song. Their society functioned through cooperation, custom, and accountability, rather than chaos or brute force. Raiding was only one expression of a much broader culture, one capable of building cities, sustaining long-distance exchange, enforcing law without centralized states, and producing art and technology admired even centuries later. The Norse were not destroyers standing outside civilization, but participants in it, shaping the medieval world through skill, organization, and ambition. And so, in closing, we see that barbarian is a misnomer for the early Northern European societies The Celts, Germanic tribes, and Norse Vikings each possessed all the attributes of civilization: social stratification and government, commerce and craftsmanship, laws and moral codes, learning and lore. The myth of the savage northerner was largely a construct of Roman prejudice and later Romantic exaggeration. Primary accounts from the Romans, when read carefully, actually reveal admiration for these people's laws, bravery, and social bonds. Modern archaeological and historical research has further shattered the old myth, unveiling an astonishing level of sophistication, from Celtic goldwork to Germanic assemblies to Viking navigational science. These societies were different from the Mediterranean norm, yes, but different does not mean inferior. Their oral epics, intricate art, and enduring customs enrich the tapestry of European history. When we refer to them simply as barbarians, we not only do them an injustice, we also lose sight of the remarkable human diversity and creativity they embody. In truth, the early peoples of Northern Europe were co-authors of the civilizational story, founders of cities, framers of laws, and makers of meaning, deserving respect and understanding beyond that old barbarian stereotype. And as we have seen through a calmer and clearer lens, they were truly never barbarians at all. So with that being said, if y'all enjoyed my first video, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you. I'll see y'all next time.